Father, thank you for your word. As we share your word today, I just thank you that our hearts are open to receive it. I am anointed to minister to it. And God, it's going to, I always believe when we're exposed to the truth of the word of God, that if we embrace it, it changes our life. And every opportunity that we spend in your word is an opportunity for life change. And so I declare that over us this morning in Jesus' name. Amen. You ready for the word? We're going to be looking at beginning in Hebrews chapter 11 this morning. And I felt when I was, I taught a couple of weeks ago on God's Wonder Women, and we looked at Esther, one of those last week. And we're going to touch on Sarah, but really we're going to minister about Sarah and Abraham. And so this begins in verse 8 of chapter 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many of the stars of the sky, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. We're really focusing on verses 11 and 12. When we're looking at Sarah, she received strength to conceive seed. She bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And then when it spoke of Abraham, it said that he was as good as dead. So in other words, it's speaking about age. What I want to talk about is Abraham and his receiving what God had promised to him, and the process that's involved with this. If we go back to Genesis chapter 12, God begins to speak to Abraham, and he begins to speak into his life the promise. Now the Lord said, verse 1, to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God tells Abram that he's going to make of him a great nation. And then 3 chapters later, he clarifies that promise even more. In chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, he says, "And after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward.' But Abraham said, 'Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?' Then Abram said, 'Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir.' And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir.' Then he brought him outside and said, 'Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them.' And he said to him, 'So shall your descendants be.' And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness." So God makes it very clear to Abraham that he is going to have a child, that he and Sarah are going to have a child, even though at this age he's childless. So the promise to Abraham, or Abram, is that he's going to have a child, and through the child a multitude will descend, and through that multitude the whole earth will be blessed because of it. Now the first thing we need to understand is that we can receive a promise at any age.
Amen.
At any age. Jeremiah was called when he was younger. In Jeremiah chapter 1, it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. And I said, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am a youth, for you shall go to all to whom I send you. And whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord." So God begins to speak over Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, I'm too young. I'm just a youth. And God says to him, don't say that you're just a youth, because I can use you, and I want to use you at your young age. Timothy faced the same challenge in the New Testament. In 1 Timothy 4:12, it says, let no one despise your youth. Be an example to the believers in word and conduct, in love and spirit, and in faith and in purity. So don't let anyone despise your youth. God can give you a promise when you're young, and most of the time he does. But in Abram's case, it was not that he was too young. In his eyes, he was too old. So, you are never too young to receive a promise, and you are never too old to receive a promise.
Amen.
Right? So I'm not just talking to the young people here this morning. I'm talking to the older people. I don't care what age you are never too old to receive a promise from God.
Amen.
Now, Moses was 80 years old. Think about that. He was 80 years old when he stepped into the promise of delivering Israel from Egypt. Abraham was 75 years old when the promise was first given to him in chapter 12. Then God confirmed the promise to him again, and this time Abraham is 99 years old. All right, we don't have anyone in here that's 99. All right? In chapter 17, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in the generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. And I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So Abraham receives the promise. It's confirmed. Now, there are several principles I want us to look at this morning that will help us to inherit the promise of God. And actually, I kind of got, typically I'm a teacher and I give you all these points, and the last couple of weeks I got away from that. I don't think I had a point in any of them, so my last two messages were pointless. But I have 8 this morning, so I just want you to grab hold of these. We'll go through them very quickly. But number one is, we have to understand that there will be a waiting period before the promise is manifested. God gives us a promise, and most of the time when God gives us a promise, we're going to have to wait for it. Okay? Abraham waited 25 years for the promise to be fulfilled in his life. And really, we could really title Abraham's faith journey, and this is really the title of my message this morning, Believing in a Promise, but Stuck in a Tent. Okay? Believing in a promise. 25 years he was believing for this promise, but those 25 years he's stuck in a tent, and it's not being fulfilled. He knew what God's plans were for him, but he waited and waited and waited for the promise to be fulfilled. When Debbie and I met each other, she was 12 years old, and I was 14. And God just connected us, and we knew, by the time we were 16 and 14, we knew that God had placed us together, and we knew that God's call was upon our life, and we both felt the call to full-time ministry at that early age, and we knew it was going to be together. We knew God had called us as a couple. And so from the time that God spoke that into our hearts, even before we were married, to the time that we actually entered into full-time ministry, it was 18 years. 18 years. Now, God sows the vision in our hearts, but it usually doesn't happen today, or tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year, or maybe the year after that. We have to understand that. I'm still waiting for the fulfillment of promises spoken over my life in this church, and I am waiting, and they will come. There are certain things that God has spoken. We were already walking in it, but there are other things that have been spoken over us that I have not forgotten. I remember what those things are and spoken over for the church. We will walk in them, but we're still waiting. Now, here's the key, and I really want you to get this. What happens between the sowing of the seed and the desired harvest will determine whether or not there is a harvest.
Amen.
Okay? I'll say that again because I really messed it up. What happens between the sowing of the seed and the desired harvest will determine whether or not there is a harvest. And that's what we want to talk about next. What do we do in the waiting period? What do we do when God has given us the promise and we know for sure this is what God is speaking to our hearts? What do we do between that moment that God speaks to us and when that promise is fulfilled? Number one, which is actually number two, keep your faith stirred up. The greatest weapon that the enemy has against us is what the Bible calls, I believe, the sin that does so easily beset us. And the sin that so easily besets us is discouragement. When we are discouraged, that means courage has left us. When we are discouraged, that means that we are no longer walking in faith. Because if we're walking in faith, there's going to be courage, there's going to be vision, there's going to be the excitement about what lies ahead of us. But when we give into discouragement, that means that we have lost our faith in God's ability to do what He told us that He was going to do in the past. I've been there. All right? I'm not just preaching to you. I have been there. All right? So we've got to keep going. The problem is we get tired in the waiting. I love Galatians 6:9, which says, "And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." What does it say? We shall reap. We're going to reap. The Amplified says, "And let us not lose heart and grow weary and faint in acting nobly and doing right. For in due time and at the appointed season we shall reap if we do not loosen and relax our courage and faith." The Passion Translation says, and don't allow yourselves to be weary or disheartened in planting good seeds, for the season of reaping the wonderful harvest you've planted is coming. So we can't grow weary of doing good. We can't grow tired and weary of believing in the promises and doing what it takes to get to the promise, because when we give up, when we grow weary, we're going to ease up, and when we ease up, we're going to lose ground instead of gaining ground. Are you with me? Yes. So don't let discouragement, because of the wait, rob you of your harvest. Don't grow weary. Don't faint. Don't give up. Keep going. Your harvest is coming. Your promise is ahead of you. And it will come at the appointed time. God has timing for everything. So keep your faith and vision stirred up. You know, one of the ways that we do that is to remember God's faithfulness in the past. Remember. Don't forget what God has done for you in the past. Don't forget the promises that have already been fulfilled in your life. Establish memorials. You know, this is Memorial Day weekend, and we remember the great sacrifice of men and women that they made for our freedom. But we have to create memorials that remind us of God's faithfulness. You know, there were altars in the Old Testament. There were altars built all over the Promised Land. People, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who built altars because of what God had promised them, or an experience that they had with God. And whenever they would pass that altar, they would remember what that stood for. And it would remind them of the faithfulness of God. I'm not sure how that would work best for you. Maybe you need to write them down. Make a list of them. Hang them on your refrigerator. You know, hang them on the front door because you know you go there all the time. And just write those down and just remind yourself of the faithfulness of God and what God has done for you. I love the fact that it said that Sarah was able to believe and receive the promise, although it seemed impossible, because she judged God faithful who promised it. And she judged him faithful because of the experience that she had had in the past. He had been faithful in the past, and God doesn't change, so he's going to be faithful in the future. Also, listen to things that stir your faith. Listen to other people's testimonies of promises fulfilled. So stir your faith. The next thing, be quick to obey God when he speaks to you. Hebrews 11, verse 8 said, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would have received an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. So Abraham did what God told him to, even when it made no sense to him. God said, leave your country and go where I tell you. So he did. Now, I don't know about you, but I love my GPS. I can put a destination in my GPS, and I can put it in my car. I'll do that tomorrow morning. I know the way to get to my mom's. I know the way to get to her mom's. But I like it because it not just tells you the direction. I mean, sometimes I'm just driving and I'm thinking about other things, listening to music, and then I hear her voice say, you need to turn. And it just reminds me, and I need to turn. I used to do that with maps. Now, if I'm going to someplace I've never been before, I'll study the maps to see what's around there, but I don't use the maps anymore. I don't map out a route. I just put my GPS in the car, I start it, I put the destination in there, and then we go. I have learned that when I use maps, that the person that would help me use the map is asleep. And that sleepy person doesn't know how to read a map anyway, so it does me no good to have a map. I used to get those AAA trip tips, and so I just have it and I turn, but I love the GPS. It's almost like having a second wife. You put it in there and she just tells you what to do, and you just drive along. Abraham didn't have a GPS. They weren't invented back then, but even if he did have a GPS, he had no idea where he was going. He did not have a destination that he could enter into the GPS and then listen to the turns to get there. God said, look, I'm going to take you into a country you don't know. Just listen to me and I'll tell you where to go. You talk about faith. That'd be like God just telling us, just get in your car and drive and I'll tell you where to go. And so you're driving along and just listening. Okay, Lord, we'll make a left, we'll make a right, do I go straight? What do I do? Some prophetic people do that. Ain't me. But he quickly obeyed God even though he had no idea where he was going. And that's obedience and that is trust. Even after Isaac was born and God told him to go up on the mountain and sacrifice him, he did that. He had faith in God that somehow if that had happened, that God was going to raise Isaac up. But he willfully did whatever God told him to do. Listen, we do not have to have everything figured out before we obey God. Just do what he tells you. Sometimes I think we spend so much time trying to figure out why God said to do something, that by the time that we decide just to go ahead and do it, we've missed that door, we've missed that opportunity. It's too late then. So be quick to obey. Remember the next one. Don't entertain any shortcuts. In Genesis chapter 16, we find a big mistake by Abraham. About 13 years into the waiting, between seed and harvest, both he and Sarah grow weary in the wait. And they decide to take matters into their own hands. Sarah decides that she's too old to have a child, so she reasons that God must have meant that the child would have to be born by her maid. And that would still be considered her child because she owned the maid. So she's sensing, she's thinking, she's reasoning, God, you must not have understood my age. You must have missed something here. So this is what you must mean. And so she tells Abraham to go into the maid, and the maid has a child. Have you ever done something like that? Now, we're not talking about sending your husband to a maid or something like that. I'm just talking about trying to make a shortcut when God calls you to do something. God tells us something, we think, God, you must have missed something here. You didn't know this was going on, so I'm going to let you know about this because this is the route, this is the way it's going to happen. And Abraham and Sarah quickly discovered that when you try to make things happen, you only mess things up. There are no shortcuts to the promises of God. Our ways are definitely not God's ways, and our ways will ruin or at least complicate God's plans. It will create something in our lives that will always be a challenge to the true promise. You know, at least it was Sarah's idea, not Abram's. I mean, Abraham didn't go to Sarah and say, hey, old lady, you know, since this is not happening with us, let me have sex with your young maid. What do you think? No, it was Sarah's idea, but Abraham didn't object. All right, so they both made this mistake. They ended up having a son that created a nation that was an opponent to God's nation and still is today. When we do things our way, we create an Ishmael that will always oppose our Isaac. So don't take a shortcut. Still with me?
Amen.
Next one. Keep sowing seed toward the promise. Now, I'm not trying to be crude when I share this, but this is a true principle, and I really want you to get it. When we receive a promise, we must keep doing the things that will produce the promise. In Abraham and Sarah's case, the promise was a child. And in order for a husband and wife to have a child, they have to have sex. All right? There was only one immaculate conception in the Bible, and that was Mary. When the promise was first given, Abraham was 75, Sarah was 65. But then when the Lord spoke again to them, Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 89. So that means that Abraham and Sarah, at their age, had to keep having sex. And all the younger people say, now, I knew that was what you were going to say, because my children say that when they even think about their mother and I being intimate. All right? We still do, so get over it. I shouldn't share this since we're on, but I have to do this because my son told me one time, he said, Dad, we always knew when you and Mom had sex because you came out of the bedroom in a red robe. And I thought, gee, was that obvious? Now, unfortunately, Debbie threw that away. But I was thinking how neat it would be like when we were in our 90s and our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids were over at the house, that after dinner we would go upstairs for a couple of minutes and I would walk out in that red robe and really gross them out. I thought, how fun would that be? I still may look at for a red robe. I don't know that. But I'm serious about this. In order for Abraham and Sarah to have a baby, they had to keep doing what creates a baby. There were no substitutes. I'm not even sure there was a test tube back then, okay? So it was only one way for this to happen. And here's what I want us to understand. I'm not sure that any of us are believing for a child, and I don't want to make light of that. But there are other promises that God speaks into our life. Maybe you've been called to be a doctor or maybe another profession, and you know that through that profession or occupation or vocation, that is going to be the vehicle for God to use you to bless the world around you. When God speaks that promise to you, you just can't go into and just say, okay, and just kind of sit around and wait for somebody to hand you a diploma and say, okay, you're a doctor now. There is study that has to take place. There's financial investment that has to take place. If it's vocation, there's training, there's experience that you have to have. You cannot just sit and wait for somebody to give you something. There's preparation that goes into it in order for you to fulfill what God has called you to do, right? Yeah. I know Dr. Mike has shared that he just felt like God called him to be a dentist. And how long did it take you to become a dentist? 4 years of college and 4 years of dental school. He didn't just sit and just say, you know, I'm going to be a dentist in 8 years. Somebody's just going to hand me a diploma. 4 years of college, 4 years of dental school. Now, sometimes it is a prophetic word about a future ministry or something that you're going to do in the future. And we can't hear a word of prophecy and then sit back and wait for it to happen. We have to keep sowing ministry seeds toward that promise. I remember one man that came to the church years and years ago. And he was a very talented guy. And so we talked about it. And I said, well, what do you have on your heart? He said, God promised me that I was going to have this big ministry. And I said, okay. But he never got involved in anything. When you would talk to him, he had this stargazing in his eyes. It was like he was in this other place. God's got this call in my life. But he never did anything. And to my knowledge, I met him years later. And to my knowledge, it has never happened in his life because he didn't do anything in the meantime to make that happen. Now, Debbie and I had to sow toward the ministry that we felt called to. So, we were involved and have been involved in just about every area of ministry that we could find. We were involved with all kinds of ministry. And what I found that was by staying busy, it helps. It keeps your faith stirred up. It keeps you involved in what you're called to do. But we found that when we finally entered into full-time ministry, that a lot of the things that we were involved in taught us something that we needed when we got to our arrival spot. So those are not just busy times. Those are learning experiences. Those are learning how to hear the voice of God, how to minister to people, how to do those other things, even though it's not your ultimate call. So be busy. Find something to do. If your promise is full-time ministry, then find a place to serve while you're waiting. Sow seed toward the promise. Okay? Everybody still with me? Number 6. This one is so important. So important. Make life decisions with the promise in mind. And this is especially true. Debbie mentioned it, but this is especially true when it comes to financial decisions. I have seen so many people live their lives so haphazardly, and before they know it, they are in over their heads in debt, which keeps them from doing anything but working all the time. And I have seen so many people who, and so my experience is ministry, all right? And that's a lot of the things that I speak of. But I have seen so many people who for years talked about how God had called them to a certain area of ministry. And when the door opened for them to move into that ministry, they were so far in debt that they couldn't do it. And the thing that God had prepared for them, because they had made these bad decisions in the past, they were unable to step into it, and they still haven't stepped into it. And they live the rest of their lives frustrated because of decisions that they've made in the past. Right? So this is especially for younger people this morning. I'm not tooting our own horns, but I will say this, that Debbie and I made every life decision based on the fact that we were ultimately going into full-time ministry. We didn't buy a house right away. When we got married, we rented very cheaply. The first house that we bought was the farmhouse that we bought with her parents, and the reason why we bought it with her parents was because it was going to help us in full-time ministry. Our kids we wouldn't have to load up our children and take them over to the grandparents' house to watch them. They were there in their own beds every night. It didn't disturb them. And so we made life decisions based upon that fact. And when the time came for us to step into full-time ministry, we were able to take a $200 a week cut in pay. And we were able to step into it. All right? So don't mess up your future by making wrong decisions today. Still with me? Yes. If you've made wrong decisions, then God will help you. It may take a little bit of time. He will help you with those decisions to make them right. Just don't do it again. All right? So make every decision. And it doesn't have to be just full-time ministry. It can be some other profession. Make every decision, every life decision based upon the fact that you want to reach that goal, and when that door opens, you're able to step into it, and you just can't, you're not so tangled up with life or finances that you can't. Number 7, you are never too old for the promise to be fulfilled. I love Romans chapter 4. I was reading it this week in my normal Bible reading time. It says, therefore, it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations in the presence of him whom he believed, God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who contrary to hope and hope believed, so that he became the father of many nations according to what was spoken. So shall your descendants be. And not being weak in faith, he did not consider his own body already dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. He did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, he was also able to perform. God's promises are not stopped because of age. In fact, Abraham kept moving forward in faith, and even though he was old and things should not have happened because of his age, it didn't stop him from believing. He did not consider his own body, which in the natural was already dead, meaning past the age of childbearing. He did not waver at the promises of God. He called those things that were not as though they were. I stated before that Moses was born to lead Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. The promise started when he was 80 years old. And he led Israel for 40 years. Despite their older age, the time came for the fulfillment of the promise. Genesis 21, verses 1 through 3 said, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Think about that. I'm 61, and it is hard for me to keep up with my grandchildren. When it's time for them to go home, we're exhausted. We usually watch them Monday, when the kids are in school, we watch them Monday. We bring them over about 11 o'clock, so we watch them all day long, keep them overnight. We got them till the next morning. When I get home Tuesday night, I'm done. I want to go to bed. They wear me out. And it's good to send them home all sugared up. Just give them back to mom and dad. But think about this. Abraham, 100 years old, 101 years old, 102-year-old, has a 2-year-old running around his tent. There are no grandparents to send them babies to. They're stuck with that baby. I love that commercial where the couple brings the two babies and they go into the parents, and the parents or grandparents think they're having a visit, and all of a sudden the parents get in the car and take off, and say, "Don't leave us with the babies." I'm sure maybe Abraham, after the first 2 or 3 months, is like, "Whoa, help me. Well, is this what I was believing for?" Listen, because you are older, it does not mean that your days of walking in God's promises are over. God has still more in store of you, so keep on living, keep on walking, keep on dreaming, keep moving toward the promises of God. Keep speaking life and health and strength to your bodies. Don't believe the lies of the enemy that when you're 80 years old, your body should be doing these things. Come on, just speak life to them, speak strength to them, speak vitality to them. Number 8, I've only got 27 more, but this is the last one this morning. It goes with the principle of the one I just shared. The fulfillment of the promise will invigorate us and move us into new beginnings. When God's promise is fulfilled in your life, that promise is just the opening of the door. It simply allows you to step into your destiny, and then your destiny will unfold. Think about this. For Abraham, the promise was a child, but the destiny of Abraham and the child was for a nation to come forth from that child, and from that nation is going to come the Messiah that's going to bless the world. The promise will invigorate your life. There will be new fulfillment, fresh life, and you must open your heart to new dreams. Think about this. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. So that meant that she was able to see Isaac grow up 37 years. I think her life was extended because of the promise being fulfilled. She had something new to live for. Abraham was 137 years old when Sarah died. What happened to him then? Well, we know he lived 38 more years. And after Isaac married Rebekah, Abraham began a new life. In Genesis chapter 25, Abraham again took a wife. And her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward away from Isaac his son to the country of the east. This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 175 years old. So Abraham, talk about invigoration, Abraham remarries and has 6 more sons with Keturah and maybe daughters, because like I told you before the cross, before Acts, they only numbered the men, right? They only named the sons. It's very unusual to see a woman's name in a lineage of some type. But he had 6 sons through Keturah and maybe some daughters. And then verse 6 tells us that Abraham also gave gifts to the sons of the concubines that he had. That's plural. So, as concubines is at least 2, all right, to be plural. So that means he had 3 wives at least, and maybe more. Abraham was a busy man. His body was considered dead at 99, but it sure came to life after the birth of Isaac, didn't it? The fulfillment of the promise brings new life.
That's right.
And I will prophesy this over us this morning. I believe for me and for you, and especially this church, our greatest years of fruitfulness are still ahead of us. We have not seen the fulfillment of the promise yet.
That's right.
We have to keep ministering, keep sowing seed and not grow weary or lose heart. It will come if we don't faint or lose heart.
Amen.
So please, listen. God has given you a promise, and you may feel like you're stuck in a tent, but keep believing. Keep obeying. Keep your faith stirred. Don't take any shortcuts. Keep busy sowing toward the promise. Make the right decisions, and be ready when the appointed time comes to step into your destiny, and then believe God for new promises. Are you ready for that?
Yes.
Let's stand.